Welcome to this video. In this video we're going to discuss the hypothalamic-pituitary-adrenal axis, often abbreviated down to the HPA axis. So this is an endocrine axis that controls the release of the glucocorticoid hormone cortisol from the adrenal glands. So let me begin by giving an outline for the structure of this video. We're going to start off by discussing the adrenal glands, so that will be our introductory portion. Then what we're going to discuss is the synthesis and secretion of the hormone cortisol. So we'll discuss the synthetic pathway for synthesizing cortisol from cholesterol. Then what we'll move on to is discussing how the cortisol that's been released by the adrenal glands is actually transported around the blood. And then we'll move on to discussing the effects of cortisol. So we'll discuss the glucocorticoid receptor pathway, for instance, by which cortisol actually achieves a change in the behavior of cells that it is acting upon. Then what we'll discuss is what are the effects of cortisol all over the body. Now there are absolutely loads of different effects of cortisol at different tissues over the body. We will not go through all of them. We will just go through the two main classes of effects. So we'll go through the metabolic effects of cortisol, and we'll also go through the effects of cortisol on the immune system, which are of course extremely important to know about, because that's the basis of glucocorticoid therapy usually. So we'll talk about the fact that cortisol has both anti-inflammatory and immunosuppressive effects on the immune system. And I'll discuss later on what the difference between anti-inflammatory and immunosuppressive actions are. So once we've talked about the effects then of cortisol, after that what we'll do is we'll go back and talk about the hypothalamic-pituitary-adrenal axis. So you might think that I'm doing this in a backwards order, but I think this is the best way to do it. Talk about what cortisol does and then go back to talk about its control. So we'll talk about the HPA axis last, and then what we'll do is talk about what's the point of cortisol. We'll talk about the fact that the hypothalamic-pituitary-adrenal axis operates on a circadian rhythm, and we'll talk about what the function of the cortisol usually is. We'll also talk about the fact that when you are exposed to a period of stress, and this doesn't necessarily mean emotional stress. When people usually use the word stress nowadays, they're usually talking about emotional stress. But in physiology, stress doesn't necessarily mean emotional stress. It could be a physical stress, such as a trauma, infective stress, being very ill with some pathogen infecting some part of your body, or potentially biochemical stress, hypoglycemia for instance. All of these counter stresses, so an exposure to one of these stresses can lead to an increase in the hypothalamic-pituitary-adrenal axis activity, and therefore an increase in cortisol, and we'll talk about why you'd want that. So we'll come back to the sort of, the overarching, larger scale view of what this is all about right at the end. We'll go into the in-depth portions at the beginning with the synthesis of cortisol, for instance, and the glucocorticoid receptor pathway and all of that, and then we'll go back to the bigger picture at the end. Okay, so there's the outline for this video then. So to begin with then, I'm going to talk about the adrenal glands. So this is just the introductory portion. So let me draw a picture of an adrenal gland to show you the different portions of it then. So you have two adrenal glands, of course, and they sit atop the kidneys. Is this pen working? Yes, it is. And they have this sort of a shape, like so. And you can imagine that this concave surface at the bottom here would be sitting atop the kidney, so the top of the kidney would fit into this slot here. So this is our adrenal gland. This is my picture of an adrenal gland, and the adrenal glands were previously called the suprarenal glands, and you might still hear some people referring to them as the suprarenal glands, and I'll just put this here as well. You might hear them called the suprarenal glands, and that reflects the fact that they are above the kidneys. Okay, so adrenal glands or suprarenal glands. So, what are the different bits then of the adrenal glands? Well, let's start from the outside and work inwards. So the outermost portion of an adrenal gland is made up of the adrenal capsule, which I'm colouring now in orange. So this is just a protective connective tissue capsule, that is going to cover the entire adrenal gland and keep it protected, keep everything inside. Okay, so in orange, the outermost layer of an adrenal gland is the adrenal capsule. Okay, now let's go into the more interesting bit. That's just the connective tissue capsule. Let's actually go inside the capsule. What is the actual tissue of the adrenal glands then? Well, the tissue of the adrenal glands can be divided up into two portions. The outermost portion, which is known as the adrenal cortex, and then the middle center portion, which is known as the adrenal medulla. So these are just old Latin words, I would imagine, and they mean outer portion and inner portion. So medulla means middle, and I think it is the language Latin, and cortex means the outer portion. So this is the cortex, this outer portion of tissue, and then the central portion in here, this is the adrenal medulla. Okay, right, so I'll just colour them in different colours. We'll have the medulla here in red, like so, and then we'll have the cortex in green, I think. Now, the medulla and the cortex have very different functions. The medulla contains what are known as the adrenal chromaffin cells, and these adrenal chromaffin cells are responsible for producing and secreting the hormone adrenaline, also known as epinephrine in the United States. So the adrenal medulla synthesizes the hormone adrenaline, which is also known by the American name, which is epinephrine, like so. And of course, this is an incredibly important hormone in the fight or flight response. So if you're in imminent mortal danger, so let's say some tiger has just crept up on you and you've just seen it, then what happens is your body undergoes a massive change known as the fight or flight response. Activities in those of different portions of your body changes, and what coordinates all of these changes in the behaviours of all these different portions of your body? Well, one of the things is that a huge amount of adrenaline gets released into your bloodstream, and this is because of the adrenal medulla. So the nervous system activates the adrenal medulla to release adrenaline. It releases adrenaline into the blood, and adrenaline goes around and tells the body we are in huge danger, change your actions. So it goes around and tells loads of different bits of the body to change their behaviour in some way, and this gets you ready to either fight the imminent danger source or run from the imminent danger source. So, for example, adrenaline makes the heart beat faster and more powerfully, so that more blood is being pumped around the body. The cardiac output is higher, which will mean that there's more blood going to the skeletal muscle cells, which is necessary if you're going to either fight or flight, because you're going to have to use your muscles in both of those activities. Okay, so the adrenal medulla produces adrenaline or epinephrine. The cortex, on the other hand, produces a variety of different steroid hormones, and I will discuss in just a moment what is actually meant by a steroid hormone, but I'm sure you have heard the term before. You might not actually know what the strict definition of a steroid hormone is, but you will soon. So the cortex is involved in producing steroid hormones. Adrenaline is not a steroid hormone. Okay? Now, the adrenal cortex produces lots of different steroid hormones. By the way, cortisol is a steroid hormone. You can call it a corticosteroid, and in fact, I'll introduce that term here. So, people often use the word corticosteroids, and this means the steroid hormones that are produced by the adrenal cortex, because there are other steroid hormones in the body that are not produced by the adrenal cortex, and those would not be called corticosteroids. So if you hear that term, and it is in common use, corticosteroids, it means the steroid hormones that are produced by the adrenal cortex, and there are, as I say, lots of examples of steroid hormones that are not produced by the adrenal cortex and therefore are not corticosteroids but are steroids. Okay, so the adrenal cortex, it can be further divided into 3 separate layers, and these 3 separate layers are going to produce different steroid hormones. So it is important to split the adrenal cortex into these 3 separate layers. So let's imagine cutting a little portion of the adrenal gland out here. So let's cut out this little square here. Okay, now I'm going to draw this here. So here we'll have the 2 boundaries. So this is where you'll have the capsule of the adrenal gland here. Okay, and then below here you'll have the adrenal medulla in red. So I hope it's clear. And now what I'm going to do is actually emphasize the fact that the cortex can be split into 3 separate layers like so. So an outer layer, a layer that's inside of that, and a layer that's inside of that. So it's like an onion effectively, it's got many layers. Okay, adrenal medulla is in the middle, then surrounding that you've got this innermost layer, surrounding that you've got a next layer, surrounding that you've got the next layer, and then you've got the capsule on top of that. Okay, so what are these layers? So we'll work from the outside to the inside. So they're all known as zonas. So the first one is zona glomerulosa. So they're all given very big, pretentious names. So this is zona glomerulosa, this top there, and I'll colour zona glomerulosa in pink. And the cells of zona glomerulosa are involved in producing the corticosteroid aldosterone. So these cells produce the corticosteroid aldosterone, which is very important in causing the increased absorption of salt and therefore water in the nephrons of the kidney. So it's important in retaining fluid volume. If your blood volume is too low, for instance, you will activate a pathway known as the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, which will result in the release of aldosterone, and that aldosterone will then drive the kidneys to stop producing as much urine, basically, and retain water and salt, retain fluid, to try and bring blood volume back up, to shift the equilibrium and try and bring blood volume back up. So aldosterone is very important in the control of blood volume, and more generally extracellular fluid volume. Of course, the extracellular fluid consists of the blood and also the tissue fluid, the interstitial fluid, and they're continuous with one another. So if blood volume is too low, it will be because extracellular fluid volume as a whole is too low, and aldosterone is important in bringing extracellular fluid volume back up to what it should be. Okay, now it is described, you can describe it as a corticosteroid, but it has another fancy term that is used just for it. It's described as a mineralocorticoid because its actions affect mineral levels in the body. You know, its role is to increase sodium reabsorption and thereby increase water resorption, fluid resorption. So it's described as a mineralocorticoid. In the same way that cortisol is a glucocorticoid, this is a mineralocorticoid. So it's given this special name. And they're both corticosteroids. So aldosterone is a corticosteroid. Okay, so that's zona glomerulosa. Those cells are important in producing aldosterone. Let's now go to the layer underneath zona glomerulosa. So I'll colour in this next layer in yellow here. Okay, so this next layer is the zona fasciculata. So this is zona fasciculata, and this is the layer that we're interested in. This is the one that's involved in producing cortisol, the glucocorticoid. So this is the star of the show, basically. Zona fasciculata here. So as I say, this is involved in producing the hormone that we are going to spend our entire video talking about, which is cortisol, and this has a special term that's applied to it, which is that it is a glucocorticoid, because one of its major actions is going to be to raise fasting blood glucose level. So it affects glucose, hence it's a glucocorticoid. And again, the corticoid just refers to the fact that we are being produced by the adrenal cortex here. Okay, so cortisol there. Next, let's go down to the final layer, which we're not really going to say much about. I'm just trying to come up with a colour to colour it in. We'll have it in green here. This is the zona reticularis. This produces certain androgens, not testosterone, but other androgens. So this is zona reticularis, like so. And this produces androgens. So let me give you some examples of androgens that it can produce. So androstenedione is one of the androgens that it can produce. So androstenedione. And then the other one is dehydroepiandrosterone, which is often abbreviated down to DHEA, like so. So this stands for dehydro. Okay, so dehydro, and then epiandrosterone, Okay, like so. So both of these are androgens, so they're both grouped under androgens, and of course they are corticosteroids. They're both steroids produced by the adrenal cortex, and hence they are corticosteroids. Okay, right, so I'll just underline everything in green. So this is zona reticularis, the bottommost layer of the adrenal cortex, which produces the androgens, and here are some examples: androstenedione and dehydroepiandrosterone. Okay, right, so those are the different layers of the adrenal cortex, and we've seen the one that we're interested in, zona fasciculata. We're now just going to talk about the zona fasciculata. We're going to forget about the others. I just want to put it in context, which is why I've talked about these other layers here. Okay, so now, zona fasciculata. It's going to be made up of loads of very boring looking cells. They're going to, just be circular little cells like so. So I'll draw them in here with nuclei like so. And these cells, their job is going to be to synthesize and then secrete into the bloodstream the glucocorticoid hormone cortisol. Okay, so where to begin then? So what I want to go through is the pathway by which they actually synthesize cortisol. And they don't store cortisol is an important point to add. When they are stimulated to make cortisol, and we'll talk about the thing that stimulates them to actually synthesize and secrete the cortisol, they make it on the spot. They don't store it. It's very lipid soluble, so it's very difficult to store. Remember, neurotransmitters and other molecules that are destined to be secreted, the usual way in which they're stored are they're put in nice little vesicles, but that relies upon the molecule not being able to get out of the vesicle by just diffusing through the membrane. If you've got a lipid soluble molecule, you just can't contain it like that way, in that sort of a way. It has to be non-lipid soluble to be able to contain it like that. Cortisol is lipid soluble. Most of the steroid hormones are lipid soluble, so you can't store it in that way. So it has to be synthesized on the spot when you actually want to secrete it into the bloodstream. Okay, so to begin with then, I'm going to go through the synthesis pathway, and I'm going to go through all the chemical formulas for this because I love this. You might not love it, but it's worthwhile knowing. We're going to go through the synthesis pathway whereby you take cholesterol molecules to cortisol molecules. So I'm going to begin by showing you the structure of cholesterol, but before we talk about cholesterol, we need to know what a sterol is, and before we talk about what a sterol is, we need to know what a steroid is. So here comes my discussion of what is actually meant by this word, a steroid. Now, this is something that I found very surprising when I learnt it for the first time. I was expecting the definition of a steroid to be some molecule with incredible biological activity. That was my understanding from popular knowledge that general society had given me. That a steroid was one of these molecules that had some incredible biological activity, an incredibly biologically powerful molecule that was capable of having huge effects on the body. I thought that its definition, i.e., would be biological. However, the definition of a steroid is not biological. The definition of a steroid was made by chemists. It is a chemical definition. A steroid is just a molecule where the chemical structure of that molecule is based on a certain structure, and I'm about to draw that structure out for you. So all steroid molecules have in their chemical structure something along the lines of this core structure that I'm about to draw. So I'm about to draw the core steroid structure. Now, most steroids don't have this in its purest form inside them. Instead, they are modifications of this structure. Okay, so I'm going to draw the core steroid structure, the molecule on which all other steroid molecules are similar to. So the core steroid structure is actually extremely boring. It just consists of carbon atoms and hydrogen atoms. So the best way to draw it is in skeletal formula, because remember, in skeletal formula we don't show carbon atoms and we don't show hydrogen atoms attached to carbon atoms. So you can imagine that the core steroid structure is going to end up looking ridiculously simple. And indeed it does, so we'll do this. So, overall, you have 17 carbon atoms in the steroid core structure, and God only knows how many hydrogens. I've never bothered to count. And these 17 carbons are arranged into 4 rings, 3 of which are 6-membered, and one of which is 5-membered. So I'm drawing this out now. So remember, we are drawing a skeletal formula, so the points, the corners of this, are representing the carbon atoms. So here we have 2 rings, so overall so far I think we've got 10 carbons there if you count them. And now let's have another ring up here, another 6-membered ring, and then finally we'll have a 5-membered ring, like so. This is the core steroid structure. So this is a molecule. This skeletal formula is showing you a molecule. I know it looks deceptively simple. It looks so simple that it doesn't look like a chemical formula. But remember, the reason it looks so simple is that it is just carbon atoms with hydrogen atoms attached to the carbon atoms. Okay, so if we were to draw its structural formula, it would look much more complicated, and it would look much more like a chemical formula, but it would, it's complicated and it takes time to do that, so we'll stick with the skeletal formula even though it looks a bit unlike a chemical formula. This has 17 carbons in it, and the next thing that I want to tell you about this molecule is that there is certain nomenclature that we use commonly, so we name these rings up. So we call this first ring the ring A of the core steroid structure, we call this second ring the B ring, third ring the C ring, and fourth ring the D ring. So this is nomenclature that you will see all the time when referring to steroid structures. So I'll repeat it again, that steroid molecules, if you're describing some other molecule that isn't necessarily this one as a steroid molecule, such as cortisol for instance, we'll see the structure of cortisol very soon, it is not this structure, but it's related to this structure. All steroid molecules have a structure very similar to this. They contain something along the lines of this, 4 rings like this, and we'll use the same names for the rings as we've got here. A ring, B ring, C ring, and D ring. In addition, the nomenclature goes even further. Not only have we agreed the names of the rings already, but we also agree the numbering of all of the carbon atoms in these interjoined 4 rings. So we call this one up here carbon number 1, and then we just go round in a reasonably logical way. So we go from carbon number 1, then we go round here, and we call this one carbon number 2, round to here, we call this one carbon number 3, round to here, this one can be carbon number 4, carbon number 5, carbon number 6, carbon number 7, carbon number 8, carbon number 9, carbon number 10. Oh dear, we've closed a loop, so we'll have to jump off somewhere, so we'll go up to here, that's a reasonably logical place to go next. Carbon number 11, carbon number 12, carbon number 13, carbon number 14, carbon number 15, carbon number 16, and carbon number 17 there. So those are the numbers that we ascribe to all of the carbon atoms in this core steroid structure. So finally, to repeat it, because it's worth repeating, this molecule that I have drawn you here, this actual molecule, which you could build if you were a chemist, this is the core steroid molecule. Steroids are a huge class of molecules that have structures, all of them, similar to this molecule. They have these same 4 rings of carbon atoms, and we name the rings up with these letters, and we name the carbons in these 4 rings up with these same numbers. Okay, so that's what a steroid molecule is. Now, we want to draw out the structure of cholesterol, and cholesterol is a sterol. So let me firstly, before we go on to the structure of cholesterol, just talk about what is a sterol. So a sterol is a subset of the class of molecules that are steroids. So steroids are a huge great class of molecules, all of which have a structure based on this molecule here. Sterols are a subset of that great big class, which all have a structure based on the structure that I'm about to draw out, which is a steroid, i.e. it's based on this structure. So let me now draw out the core sterol molecule. So the core sterol molecule contains the core steroid structure, so I'll draw this out quickly. So here is A ring, here is B ring, here is C ring here, and here is D ring here. But now the only change is that on carbon number 3, rather than having 2 hydrogens coming off it, as indeed we had here, we're going to take one of those hydrogens off and replace it with an alcohol group. So ol means alcohol generally, and indeed it does here. So sterol, the core sterol structure, is this molecule here. Sterols are a massive great class of molecules, all of which have structures based on this molecule here. So they have a similar structure to this. So of course all sterols are steroids because they've all got the steroid structure within them, but not all steroids are necessarily sterols because they don't necessarily have to have an alcohol group coming off carbon number 3 there. Okay, so that's what sterols are, and indeed cholesterol is going to be an example of a sterol. So now let me tell you about this important molecule cholesterol. So I'm sure you've heard of cholesterol before. It's a very important sterol in biology, and it's going to be the starting point for the synthesis of all of the steroid hormones. It's a molecule that is readily available in the diet. In addition, the body can actually synthesize it. The cells of the zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis can all synthesize cholesterol, and they can use this to produce their steroid hormones. And by the way, just to utterly stress this point, aldosterone, cortisol, androstenedione, and dehydroepiandrosterone, they are all steroids. They all have a structure which contains something very similar to this core steroid structure here. And they're going to be synthesized from this molecule cholesterol, which is a sterol and therefore has a structure very similar. Well, it has a steroid structure inside of it. Okay, so let me now show you then the structure of cholesterol, and then we'll actually go through the synthetic pathway by which we can go from cholesterol to cortisol. Okay, so cholesterol then, so it's going to be based on this molecule, and we're going to make overall 3 modifications to this molecule to turn it into cholesterol. So let me talk you through these 3 modifications. First I'll just draw out the core sterol structure again, and then I'll talk you through the 3 modifications. So here is A ring, here is B ring here is C ring here, and here is D ring here. And then we've got the alcohol group coming off carbon number 3 here to turn this into the core sterol structure over the core steroid structure. Okay, so the 3 modifications then that we're going to make to this molecule to turn it from the core sterol structure into cholesterol are as follows. Firstly, we are going to put in a double bond, and we're going to put in a double bond between carbon number 5 and carbon number 6. So currently, if we look at this, carbon number 5 has 3 bonds to other carbons, and therefore 1 bond to a hydrogen. Carbon number 6 has 2 bonds to carbons, and therefore 2 bonds to hydrogens. Take a hydrogen off carbon 5, take a hydrogen off carbon 6, and form another bond between the two to turn their link into a double bond, like so. Okay, that's the first modification we're going to make in turning the core sterol molecule into cholesterol. Next, we're going to add 2 methyl groups on, and we're going to put these on carbon 10 and carbon 13. Now, carbon 10 and carbon 13 are actually very similar. Both of them have got 3 links to other carbon atoms and 1 link to a hydrogen atom. Let's stick methyl groups off them in place of that hydrogen atom. So take the hydrogen off carbon 10, take the hydrogen off carbon 13, stick methyl groups on, like so. And this is the way that methyl groups are shown on a skeletal formula. Now, finally, the most complicated modification is what we're going to do off carbon 17. So we're going to take a hydrogen off carbon 17 and we're going to stick an 8-carbon side chain off carbon 17, like so. So we're going to have 1 carbon here, the 2nd carbon of this side chain is going to actually attach to carbon 17, then we're going to have carbon number 3, carbon number 4, carbon number 5, carbon number 6, carbon number 7, and then off carbon number 6 we're going to have another carbon coming off like so. So it's not the simplest side chain to stick off in the world, but it consists of 8 carbons then. It does look reasonably symmetrical, so it's reasonably easy to remember how to draw it. Okay, so this is a molecule of cholesterol. This is the skeletal formula for cholesterol. You can see that it clearly is a sterol, and therefore clearly it's a steroid. So cholesterol is a steroid, and we're going to use it in all 3 layers of the adrenal cortex to produce the corticosteroids. We are, of course, interested in zona fasciculata, which will be turning cholesterol into the glucocorticoid cortisol. Okay, so just before we move on, let me tell you about how the carbons in cholesterol are numbered up. The ones that are in the steroid ring are numbered up exactly the same as always, but we've added on more carbons, so how are they labelled up? Well, the way you do it is you get to 17 here, and then you have to go up further. So the way that someone has decided to do this is that you skip to this one first, you call that one there, that one, the carbon of the methyl group of carbon 13, you call that number 18, then you skip down to this one, you call that one number 19, then you go to the side chain that comes off carbon 17 up here. So you call this one that's directly off carbon 17 20, you then go to this one which is 21, then you go to the other side which is 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27. So overall cholesterol now has 27 carbons in it. Okay, so that's just the numbering of the carbons in a cholesterol molecule in case you cared. Right, okay, so cholesterol then. This is the starting point for the synthesis of cortisol in our zona fasciculata cells. So firstly, where are our zona fasciculata cells going to get cholesterol? Well, it's a normal part of the cell membrane of all cells. All cells have cholesterol in the cell membrane. You have this one little glimpse of polarity, and you know, that will be the portion that faces out either to the cytoplasm or the extracellular base, depending on which leaflet of the phospholipid bilayer it's actually sitting in. So remember, the cell membrane consists of a phospholipid bilayer, like so, where you have the phospholipids, which are usually drawn in cartoon form like this. Here's their polar head, and here's their hydrophobic tails. Cholesterol molecules can sit just like this. You have their polar head here, and then the hydrophobic portion, which is all of this portion, sitting inwards. Okay, so they are a normal component. The cholesterol molecules are a normal component of the phospholipid bilayer. Now, of course, brilliant, but the zona fasciculata cells need their cholesterol in their phospholipid bilayer. So where are they going to get more cholesterol from once they've used this up in producing cortisol hormones? Well, the way that zona fasciculata cells get more cortisol to allow them to actually, get more cholesterol to allow them to actually be turning it into cortisol is there are two mechanisms. Firstly, they are actually capable of synthesizing it themselves. There is a pathway by which you can turn acetyl coenzyme A, which is of course an extremely important molecule in the metabolic pathways inside a cell. There is a pathway by which you can turn acetyl coenzyme A molecules into cholesterol. You can join together loads of acetyl coenzyme A molecules amazingly together and produce a molecule of cholesterol. So there is a Denovo synthesis pathway, as it's called, so I'll put this down here. So Denovo means from the beginning. So it's a synthesis pathway from, very small molecules, in particular acetyl coenzyme A, which is just 2 carbon. Well, the coenzyme A will have a lot more carbons in, but the coenzyme A isn't actually going into the cholesterol. The acetyl bit just contains 2 carbons. Right, so there is a Denovo synthesis pathway. Now, people usually know about the Denovo synthesis pathway of cholesterol because it's what's targeted by the statin drugs, but they usually know it as occurring in the hepatocytes in the liver. Now, that's the main place where Denovo synthesis of cholesterol actually occurs. But these cells of the zona fasciculata and the other layers of the adrenal cortex, they are capable of Denovo synthesis of cholesterol, so don't forget that they have that as an option. However, even though that I've put this as number 1 as the way in which they get cholesterol for the production of cortisol, it's not actually the most important way. It's an option, but it's not actually the most important way. So number 2 is the main way they get it, and they take it from the blood. So you have cholesterol stored in the blood in lipoproteins, mainly low-density lipoproteins. So low-density lipoproteins are balls of protein and fat molecules, and it's a way in which you can carry these very hydrophobic and not particularly water-soluble fat molecules around the bloodstream. And low-density lipoproteins, often known as LDLs, are a specific example of a lipoprotein that majorly carries cholesterol. So in the blood you have lots of these particles known as low-density lipoproteins, which are little balls carrying cholesterol around, and it's a means by which you can carry cholesterol around the blood even though it's incredibly insoluble in water. Okay, so there are low-density lipoprotein particles, which are little spheres if you want to have a picture of them in your mind. So I'll just draw a little picture here. It's a little sphere and you've got loads of cholesterol stored inside it. You have these in your bloodstream, and the cells, the zona fasciculata cells, they can access the cholesterol that is in these LDL particles, so they can take the cholesterol out of the bloodstream, and that's the main way in which they get cholesterol delivered to them for the synthesis of cortisol. And the same goes for all the other layers of the adrenal cortex, which are synthesizing these other corticosteroids. So that's the major way that these zona fasciculata cells are going to actually access cortisol. Sorry, not cortisol, cholesterol. Right, I think I actually need a break now. We will have a break here, and in the next video we will look at the synthesis pathway by which you turn cholesterol into cortisol in these zona fasciculata cells.